All right, so next I want to talk about some of the issues that can happen when you have like disordered motivation. The first one we're going to talk about is addiction, which, you know, we've had a lot of fun today. Addiction is a much heavier topic, obviously. And, you know, I'll start by saying if anything we talk about right now is triggering in any way, either you've dealt with addiction yourself, you have family members who have, whatever, if you feel like you need to leave or take a break, that's completely fine with me. So I'm kind of debating how I should start. Sometimes I start this discussion by asking people about personal experiences with addiction. I don't know. Let's see. I'll do this. I'll share my experiences with addiction, and then if any of you feel compelled to share, you're welcome to. No one has to, okay? So my main experience with addiction is through my family. So my dad is severe alcoholic, and most of like his, you know, family falls into that same category, basically. He has been for essentially my entire life. And I bring this up really just to give you kind of an illustration of what addiction looks like. Most of you have probably seen it in some form or other. But, you know, just some of the things that kind of stick out to me that I've noticed throughout experiencing, I guess, watching addiction in someone else, is that often people with addiction make really terrible choices, right? That's probably very obvious. And sometimes it can be difficult to understand, like, what motivates those choices. Why do they make the choices that they do? I remember, especially when I was much younger, like as a kid, like constantly questioning, like, why is my dad doing this? It's obviously terrible and detrimental to the family. Why would he keep making these choices? But he does, right? Like a lot of addicts do. As a society, I think we tend to view those choices through like a moral lens, right? And I think the way that our society treats addiction kind of speaks to that, right? Like if someone has an addiction, for the most part, you know, they're going to go to prison or have some sort of criminal repercussions because of it. Where, you know, the reality of it, which I'm sure all of you have heard to some extent, is that it's a disease, right? It's a disease of the brain, essentially, which we're going to learn about today. So, you know, like some of the choices my dad would make, these are some of, you know, the ones I'm willing to share at least. We lived in a dry county in southwest Kansas, which means like you couldn't buy alcohol on Sundays. So he would often drive down to the Oklahoma border, which was like 45 minutes from our house, so that he could buy alcohol there. He'd go there, drink it all, and then drive back. So he'd be like completely wasted driving this 45-minute drive. Sometimes he would take me and my brothers with him. So, you know, made a lot of decisions where he was drunk driving very often. It's honestly like miraculous that nothing worse ever happened. So, you know, things like that on a very common basis. For a long time, like I said, I questioned a lot of things he did. I was like very angry. There's been times where I've completely cut my dad off, stopped talking to him. Other times where I've kind of brought him back into my life. I think understanding the psychology of addiction and the neuroscience of it, though, like really changed my perspective of like the choices he made and the things that he did. So I'll ask, you know, maybe everybody close their eyes too, if you want, to make this a little more anonymous. And just like, if you know anyone who's struggled with addiction, if it's impacted your life in any way, just raise your hand, just so I can get a... Okay, so that's, you know, a lot of people in the class have you know, had some kind of encounter with this, which is very common. Anytime I ask that question, it's usually like 75% of the room that raises their hand. So, anybody want to share anything? Again, no expectations, but yeah, Devin.
My sister was a heroin addict for a while.
Wow, yeah.
She has 2 kids, and she's totally definitely.
That's great. Yeah, that's good to hear.
I'm glad she didn't die before I met her. It was my half sister.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So we have the same dad, but moms.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Anybody else? Yeah.
My oldest brother has the same problem, and he's in prison because of his actions.
Oh, geez. That's rough. Thank you, though. Yeah, Scott.
So my parents, all 3 of them, all have had a major addiction to early MMOs.
Okay.
So like EverQuest.
Yeah.
And it ended up leading to a lot of estrangeness between me and my 6 siblings and just our parents in general.
Yeah.
We don't really communicate much with each other, and there's only like myself and one other that's like a hub that everybody comes to for information.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, it's to like impact the family in very like sort of domino effect, like reverberating ways. Yeah. Yeah. MMO is a type of video game, right? Just
yes,
so okay.
It's massively multiplayer
yeah.
online. EverQuest was like one of the major first ones that came out in the mid-90s. games,
Yeah.
and they spend all day, every day playing.
Yeah, just for whatever, whenever you said it, my brain was thinking like medication, just because most of the time when we're talking about addiction, there's, you know, like some sort of whatever, but yeah, so I was thinking like MMO, is that like an SSRI or, you know what I mean? But yeah, but no, but then you said EverQuest, I was like, wait, that's a video game. So yeah, it's interesting you bring that up too, because one of the things, whenever I have like a whole lecture on addiction, I often talk about like, you know, behavioral addictions versus more like chemical or, you know, substance addictions or whatever. And it's something that's, I think, a lot less recognized, but that like needs to be taken just as seriously in a lot of cases as a substance addiction, because it has a lot of like very similar effects. So I'm glad you brought that up, but sorry that you have dealt with that. Any others? Yeah,
I
Alex.
had a grandfather, and I never met him consciously. We were only alive for a very short period of time, but he was I heard a lot about him through my mom.
Yeah.
He was very important to my mom, and he was an alcoholic.
Mhm.
He passed away. He had liver disease because of that, and they weren't going to put him on any kind of priority for that because
Right.
alcohol is the reason for that.
Yeah. My grandpa on my dad's side also, he died like when my mom was pregnant with me, also from like some sort of liver disease from alcoholism. So yeah, it's like something that runs in our family, which we'll talk a little bit about genetic predisposition in a second. Okay, so, you know, I just want to kind of back up. So like I said, we all have a lot of experiences with that. Those of you who shared or those of you who have experienced it, you probably have similar stories of like those people making really terrible choices and like not, you know, choices that are illogical, that don't make sense, that lead to bad consequences probably over and over and over again. And sometimes, you know, if you have never struggled with addiction yourself or you don't know a lot about the details of it, it's easy to kind of look at, you know, from the outside and just think like, wow, this person is making terrible choices, you know, maybe question their morality, all those kinds of things. So I just kind of want to give you, before we get into the specific details, I want to give you a little bit of a different framework of how to look at addiction, which you maybe have heard before, but maybe not. So oftentimes when we talk about addiction, we talk about this area of the brain that's involved in pleasure or reward. And, you know, there's a structure called the nucleus accumbens. I'll write that down since I don't have it on here. And that's like the main, you know, area that's very active whenever we experience anything that's pleasurable. So if we eat food that we really enjoy, if you have sex to have an orgasm, nucleus accumbens is going to be going crazy. Even if you're just like spending time with people you love, doing activities you enjoy, you're going to get activity in nucleus accumbens. In particular, there's a neurotransmitter called dopamine that, you know, basically just floods the nucleus accumbens whenever you have, you know, one of those pleasurable activities. And this is the circuitry that gets kind of like miswired during addiction. But another way to talk about this circuit is not necessarily a pleasure circuit, but more of like a survival circuit. So really what it responds to is when you do something that is going to increase your chances of survival or reproduction or, you know, having offspring basically. And it's like a reward mechanism to keep you doing those activities. So whenever someone is addicted, basically their cravings for that substance get miswired with that area to where they start to treat the substance as something that they need to survive. So it's not about enjoyment, it's I need this thing to stay alive just like I need food and water and shelter. So, you know, if you think about yourself, again, you know, maybe you've never had any kind of experience with addiction yourself, but let's say that you were starving to death, right? Let's say for whatever reason you had zero access to food, you've gone a week without eating anything, and, you know, you have an opportunity to maybe steal something from someone, maybe steal, you know, some food or whatever. Do you think, you don't have to raise your hand or respond, just in your head, do you think that you would do that? Do you think you would steal to stay alive? I think probably most of us would, right? Even though we know stealing is wrong, it's maybe illogical, it's going to lead to bad consequences, we still would probably take that action if we feel like we need to do this to survive. Let's say that you are out fishing, ice fishing. You fall through the ice, you're trapped underwater, you can't get out, and you're struggling for like a whole minute, no one's there helping you, you're holding your breath as much as you can, and then another minute passes, you know, you're up to 2 minutes holding your breath. Do you think at some point you would inhale and take a breath? Probably would, right? Even though you know for sure that doing so is going to kill you. If you take that breath, you're going to die. you probably will take that breath anyways because you need to do it to survive, okay? So when someone has an addiction, those parts of the brain that sort of control that like survival instinct become cross-wired with the substance. So like I said, then they start to think heroin, alcohol, whatever it might be, like they need that thing to survive, and they will do whatever they need to do to get it because they're treating it just like food or air or anything else. So, that's why it doesn't make any sense to treat it, as a moral failing or to punish it through criminal action. People who are suffering from addiction, they need, medical care, basically, just like any other disease. They need rehabilitation to try to help them overcome that addiction, essentially through trying to rewire these circuits of the brain in various ways. Yeah.
Would
same.
the fines whether or not simple tablet form?
It depends a lot. Kind of the classic answer to that is how much it affects these different circuitries. So the things that tend to be really addictive, like stimulants, for example, cocaine, heroin would be another example. Things that are really, really addictive, they have very direct, fast impacts on this dopamine system. So, you take a hit of cocaine or whatever, it's immediately going to flood nucleus accumbens with lots of dopamine. Other substances might affect dopamine, but it's going to be more like a domino effect. So like marijuana, for example, you smoke marijuana, it's going to affect mostly like the cannabinoid system. And then there's these sort of domino effects where eventually it'll increase levels of dopamine. So, marijuana might be habit forming because it is having effects, but it's not going to be nearly as addictive as something like cocaine because it's not such a direct impact. Does that make sense? Yeah. So essentially, like I said, you have this cross-wiring of these different areas with the substance. It's been shown that there's increased risk of developing an addiction based on, first of all, genetic predisposition. So addictions tend to sort of travel in families. It's also been shown that if you have like identical twins who are separated at birth, they often will form addictions, kind of at the same rate or whatever, even if they're raised in completely different households. Another risk factor is early and repeated exposure. So if you, drink alcohol early on, or, encounter different substances early on, then that can increase the risk, especially, like I said, if there's repeated exposure. With alcohol specifically, it's also been shown that a high tolerance is a pretty huge risk factor. Like if you can drink, tons of alcohol and it doesn't affect you, that can actually lead to, addiction. There's also certain personality traits that are correlated with addiction risk as well. So things like impulsivity. Impulsivity is basically like making decisions without thinking about it ahead of time. And sensation seeking. So someone who's high in sensation seeking, they basically want lots of novel, exciting stimuli very often. Most people who are going to develop an addiction, they're going to have kind of a perfect storm of all three of these, typically. I will say, most people can use a substance and not become addicted to it. Most people can drink alcohol occasionally, not become addicted to it. Even some of the ones that we hear about being like super highly addictive, things like cocaine, for example, there are some people who can use that, a couple times and never become addicted. And that's because they probably are lacking all three of these, risk factors, so they don't, go on to develop it. Let's see. So I kind of talked about how, societally we tend to treat addiction by not really treating it, just like either ostracizing people or putting them in, prison. Some of the more effective treatments obviously would be things like rehabilitation centers, although those are not as effective, I think, as they could be. There are some movements to try to develop more like medical interventions and medical treatments. One of the ones that we don't use very often in the US, but it's used somewhat in like Europe and other countries. I'm blanking on the name, I should have wrote it down. But there's a pill that basically someone can take, specifically for alcohol and heroin. It works very effectively. Where basically if you take that pill and then you also take alcohol or heroin, you have like a very aversive reaction to it. They'll get nauseous, they'll have headaches. So it makes it so that basically using the substance is not very enjoyable. I cannot think of the name. It's also the same drug that would be used like if you are having, if you're overdosing on like heroin or something, they can give that. Probably. I need to look it up and make sure. But yeah. So in Europe, one of the things that they will do is like a treatment regimen is they will take, like, let's say someone's an alcoholic. and they want to recover, they will basically give this person a prescription for that pill for like a month, and for that whole month, the person is supposed to actually take the pill and then drink alcohol. And it basically conditions them that every time they drink, they're going to get sick, they're going to feel terrible, and usually by the end of that month, having done that every single day, that's enough for them to like never want to drink again, basically. It's sometimes used in the U.S., but not like in that kind of scheduled regimen or whatever, which I'm not entirely sure why, but yeah. So there's some movement to try to come up with more like, medical approaches to treating addiction, but I would say we're still not anywhere close to where we would want to be. All right. Again, something I could talk about for like hours. Are there any specific questions about addiction?
So,
Yeah.
Does addiction necessarily imply that it is a continuous issue, or are there like minor addictions that maybe crop up every once in a while, but generally are taken care of, are not overwhelming?
That's a good question. I've heard there's like a checklist that I sometimes show for like the criteria of what meets a addiction, and I don't think time is a factor in that. So I would say that, yeah, you could probably have an addiction that's like short-lived or whatever, and that doesn't, necessarily last for like a whole lifetime or even years or whatever.
Or like comes up every once in a while, but not constant.
Yeah. I would say one of the criteria I think for addiction though is like the idea of relapse, which is basically that if you do dip back into the substance once, then it like immediately triggers all of those addictive behaviors very quickly. So
What you're thinking of
Yeah.
fall more under like hyperfocus?
Maybe it could. I just
I
know
think-
a few weeks ago I found a new video game I really liked, and then for like a week, 2 weeks, or a week and a half, that was the only thing I was able to do that
Right.
was absolutely necessary
Yeah.
to live.
yeah, I would probably not call that an addiction,
Okay.
but yeah, but that's difficult to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe something like that. Yeah. All right. Anything else? Okay. All right. Sorry, I just realized we never took a break because I was anticipating that this PowerPoint would go faster. We might not make it to emotions today, but that's fine. Just have a couple more slides here talking about ADHD, and then we'll kind of see where we're at time-wise. So another kind of dysfunction of motivation, or sometimes portrayed that way, is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. I know a lot of you have expressed kind of an interest in this topic, either because you have it or you know someone who has it. I will say it's not something I know like a ton about. It's not like my area of expertise, but I thought I'd include it and, ask me questions if you want. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them, but I can at least point you in a direction. One of the ways that ADHD is sometimes conceptualized is that it's this disorder of what's called executive function. And executive function is basically our ability to kind of self-monitor and self-direct. And it has a couple other like components to it that we'll talk about here. It's also sometimes, like there's some psychologists that consider executive function like a part of working memory, essentially. And so, again, because it's kind of like in the moment, taking in information, directing your attention, and trying to like deal with that information as it comes in. So people who have ADHD, tend to have an inability to control attention. So, it's kind of like external stimuli control their attention for them. So they may get really ingrained in something for a really long time, even though they don't intend to. Something like video games is pretty common. And they can't break their attention away from that, even though they want to. And then they cannot focus their attention on the things they want to do. So maybe they want to, get some laundry done or do some studying or whatever. They cannot get their attention to focus on that task. If they do try to, then they're often very easily distracted. So like any kind of stimulus that comes in is going to immediately pull them away from that task. Some people with ADHD also tend to have decreased emotional regulation and decreased inhibition. So decreased inhibition means that they might, just kind of like say whatever comes to their mind without necessarily stopping themselves. And part of that decreased inhibition might be what leads to that decreased emotional regulation. So someone without ADHD, if they feel, like anger or sadness or whatever, they might be able to kind of inhibit that, whereas someone with ADHD, they might just, sort of come out, basically. They also tend to have impaired working memory. So we talked a little bit about working memory a couple weeks ago. I had you guys do a couple different tasks, like measure like how many digits you could remember. During that, I told you that most, working memory capacity is like 7 items, sort of plus or minus 2. So like the normal range for working memory is like 5 to 9 items. Typically people with ADHD, they're gonna be at that lower end of like 5 items or maybe even less than that they can hold in mind at a given time. I'll just say too, I'm kind of listing off all these things. Someone with ADHD doesn't necessarily have all of them. They might just have, kind of different bits and pieces of it. Yeah.
One thing about ADHD is it is not a description of a specific disease, but a set of symptoms. So it can be a lot of different things because of that.
Right.
And we don't necessarily even know what causes it necessarily or how exactly it functions in that way.
Yeah.
So it's I don't, yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the neuroscience of it in a second of like this might be some of the underlying brain stuff, but yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying that it's like not very clear, like is that a symptom of something else or is it, like the cause of it is not very well known. Yeah.
Well, if you're going to talk about it, this might be jumping the gun a little bit.
That's okay.
If that's the case, then could ADHD just be environmental? Like we're incredibly active creatures who sit down all day.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories I've heard about the idea that like our current society and environment is exacerbating it and even increasing the rates of ADHD. But I haven't read any like, peer-reviewed study that has like statistics and analyses and stuff that makes that claim. It's more like something I've read kind of in headlines or whatever. And so I don't know how valid it is. It makes sense to me theoretically, right?
Think of it like if you have a high-energy dog that you don't take on a walk, they're going to eat the carpet.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's also another way of sort of conceptualizing ADHD that I heard recently was this idea that, kind of thinking back to evolutionary psych, right? That in evolutionary times, I'm trying to remember the phrasing that they used. They called it, there were farmers and there was something else, I don't remember, maybe the hunters. This kind of relates back to the hunter-gatherer, right? That if you're a hunter, you go out and, having kind of like an ADHD brain in a hunting environment would actually be beneficial because you want, if there's a rustling over here, you want that to catch your attention so you can see like the deer or whatever and, respond very quickly. Someone who doesn't have that ADHD brain, they might block out that rustling and not even see the deer, right? But someone who doesn't have an ADHD brain would maybe be better at like farming, like thinking long term, I need to plant, these crops, I need to focus or whatever. So the idea is that before industrialization, everybody had like a role that they could fit into. That if you had the ADHD brain, you could go the hunter route and that would be beneficial to you. If you had a non-ADHD brain, you could go sort of the farmer route and that would be fine. But as we've industrialized, we've made an environment that's more conducive to the non-ADHD brain. So then people who have ADHD just like don't fit into that environment very well. Whereas if they had other occupations or things that they could explore, they would probably flourish and do even better than someone who doesn't have ADHD. Does that make sense? I think that's kind of getting at what you're talking about. That yeah, like our current environment, especially our school system, right? All of you right now sitting here listening to me drone on for 2 hours. If you have an ADHD brain, probably not, super easy to maintain your attention. And I understand that, but it's also like, the constraints that I'm working with as well. So yeah.
You mentioned school systems. I think that honestly makes a lot of sense in the fact that if you either have a bad experience at school, you're not well interested in specific things, you very quickly learn to hate it.
Yep.
And I think that can develop a lot of behaviors that could be learned over that huge influential period of 15 years or whatever that build up to create a bunch of very bad avoidant behaviors, and that could be a huge part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I have a lot of strong opinions about our education system, but yeah.
I was medicated for my ADHD for 10 years. I stopped taking Adderall when I was probably like 14.
Mm-hmm.
I found, this is just my experience with the schools I went to, they only really taught to neurodivergent brains and didn't really know what to do with us, so we were in trouble all the time.
Yeah.
They were constantly getting us in trouble, and it was just a miserable time up until I got to high school, and that's when it really changed for me because my teachers started to see me more as a human being and
Yeah.
not just an issue and a problem.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm really enjoying about college because my high school teachers and my college professors so far, they have some more understanding and more of a grasp of this is a person. This isn't just someone trying to be a nuisance and bother to a class.
Yeah.
It's been a lot so far.
I'm glad that it improved for you, but it sucks that it was bad for the first like 14 years. That's yeah. But it's like, I also sometimes too, like, I can sympathize with teachers because they're put in a situation where, like, you know, they have way more kids than they should have to deal with. They're massively underpaid. They have, you know, all these other things going on. So it's like the whole system just seems not built very well anymore for, you know, what it's supposed to do. So yeah, but I mean, one of the issues too, I would say with ADHD, kind of relating back to what you were saying of like, is it just a symptom of other things? It is often misdiagnosed, both, you know, that there might be some other issue that gets diagnosed as ADHD, or someone has ADHD and it's overlooked and not diagnosed. So yeah, there's a whole history of like trying to even just define it and what it is. Like for a long time, there was ADD and ADHD as like separate things. And then at some point they decided like they're both the same thing. It's just that people with ADD don't have that hyperactivity component. Like they might not have the, you know, emotional outbursts or whatever. So I think we still don't really know what it is or isn't, or, you know, how to classify it or what causes it. So I feel like there's still, you know, a lot of questions basically.
On that, it's like I got medicated for ADHD only like within the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And more than anything with my concentration, it's helped depression I didn't know I had.
Right.
And I feel like maybe just like living with that could have also developed the behaviors that that for me anyway, and the symptoms that I exhibit are called ADHD.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I could totally see that because some, you know, people with depression also often struggle with motivation. They have a hard time, you know, just like getting out of bed and doing things if the depression is bad enough. So yeah, Devin.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
What I found is a lot of females with ADHD, myself included, were more likely to struggle with depression and anxiety because the difference between male ADHD and female ADHD is so vastly different.
Right, yeah. It's also been drastically underdiagnosed in women because it's often not, like male, you know, young boys, especially with ADHD, their emotional outbursts often might be more like physical or, you know, even aggressive. And so teachers might want to like deal with that very quickly and get a diagnosis. Whereas, you know, a female who has that lack of emotional regulation, like she might cry more often or, you know, and it's things that's not necessarily so disruptive. So then it's not like, you know, addressed as quickly, basically. So you get a lot of diagnosis in females for sure.
I wasn't diagnosed for a long time because I had a more feminine kind of ADHD.
Right, yeah.
At least that's what I've said because that's from what
Yeah.
I've heard, you know. It's like I wasn't running around, I wasn't making a lot of trouble or anything like that. I just didn't, I was just in my own head space.
That makes sense, yeah.
Can that also be like passed off as like the over crying or the like just dismissed as like, oh, that's just a woman thing?
Yes, yeah.
And like boys can be boys, you know, they're just
Yep.
hyperactive and crazy, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's another reason it often gets overlooked. All right, I have one more slide on this, and then I think we'll be done for today. So we were kind of talking about, you know, what's the cause of it. We know, you know, all of this is like very correlational. So it's again getting back to that, like, is this the cause? Is it a symptom of something else? We don't really know. We do know that people with ADHD tend to have some, you know, irregularities in brain development. So for example, they often have decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is one of the last areas of the brain to be myelinated. So remember, myelin is like the fatty stuff that wraps around the neurons that makes it go faster, basically. And, you know, for most people, the prefrontal cortex will not be fully myelinated until you're in like your early 20s. So some of you might not even have, you know, fully developed prefrontal cortexes right now, basically. But someone with ADHD, that sort of lags behind even more, basically, where they might not ever get that fully myelinated prefrontal cortex, and that whole process kind of starts later and doesn't develop as, you know, effectively or quickly, basically. And we know prefrontal cortex is really important for basically all the things I just listed. It's really important for, you know, directing attention, for self-regulation, etc. It also seems like there's sort of improper utilization of dopamine and another neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, which is also active in the nucleus accumbens. So if you think about this whole, like, you know, circuitry we talked about, the whole goal of it is to motivate behavior. And it seems like people with ADHD, they might produce less dopamine and norepinephrine. And even if they do produce the same amount, their brains are less sensitive to it. They don't respond to it in the same way. So kind of that whole motivation circuitry seems to be disrupted, basically. Some of you already talked about treatment. ADHD is often treated with stimulant medications, which seems counterintuitive to a lot of people when they first hear it. Like if you have someone who's hyperactive, why would you give them stimulants? But basically what the stimulants do, they specifically stimulate this part of the brain. They specifically stimulate the prefrontal cortex that has that lower activity. So it's basically helping like increase those executive function skills. It's been shown, interestingly, that cognitive behavioral therapy is actually just as effective as those stimulant medications. So cognitive behavioral therapy involves mostly like learning how to sort of change your thoughts and your behaviors, basically. So learning like new skills, coping skills, different techniques to kind of change the environment around you to make it easier to basically cope with having the ADHD. So they're both about equally effective alone, but the most effective is to do both of them together, to have the stimulant medication and the cognitive behavioral therapy. I'll also mention there are some non-stimulant alternatives for, if you have someone who maybe has like a history of addiction, for example, you probably wouldn't want to give them a stimulant because that might trigger that addiction or make it worse. So there are some non-stimulant alternative medications as well. Any other questions or thoughts about ADHD? Okay. Well, we didn't make it to emotions, but that's fine. Maybe we'll do that next time. So that's all I've got for you today.